female finance collective where we encourage women to have open and honest conversations about all things money.
Welcome to episode number 2 in our series about money mistakes. And today we're going to talk about budgeting mistakes. Budgeting can feel like a bad word to a lot of people. I know some people live and die by their budget, but for other people, it's like really scary and intimidating and overwhelming, and it feels too restrictive and all of these negative things. So we're hoping to kind of dispel some of that for you today and focus on some of the mistakes that people make, and then while we're sharing about the mistakes, maybe help you feel like the budget could actually be a benefit, not such a bad guy, but really more of a helper when it comes to managing your money. So the first mistake that we're going to talk about is not having a budget at all. So do either of you have any thoughts on just rolling with it with no budget at all and like kind of flying by the seat of your pants?
So I've definitely had times where I've done this personally. This is kind of the scenario that played out for me is I was in a corporate job. My income was very, very consistent. So you get used to certain spending habits. You're still playing within the guidelines. So I wasn't taking on debt. But as my income grew, so did my purchasing. And I sort of lost track of where my money was going. And the reason that this became a problem was a lot of what I was spending was going into things that were just more consumer driven purchases, like home decor, for example. I had, plenty of cash flow each month, and I'd love to decorate. And without kind of some guidelines or budgets or just knowing where my money was going, I was spending on things that didn't bring as much value and joy to our life as I would have liked. So having a budget, having no budget is pretty much like going on a road trip without knowing where you are going, not packing water, not having an overnight bag if you're going for the weekend. You're just sort of winging it. And money really likes to have a place to go, and it likes to have direction. So this is where doing a budget is really, really helpful. And it's something that I think should be done every year because our life changes. So just having those guidelines can be very, very helpful.
I agree. I used to not have a budget at all. And because I didn't want to think about money, because money just was like, I thought it was terrible and scary, and I was not good with money. These are the terrible things I used to tell myself. And so I would just spend. And then at the end of the month, if I ran out of money, I would just use my credit card until I got to the next month because I had no budget. I literally had no idea how much I was spending or where I was spending it. So I love the way that you described that. It doesn't have to be super strict and restrictive. It can be just more of like a map or a guide.
Yeah, absolutely. I realized I lived pretty frugally and just had some of those values in me. And then when I started making more money when I moved to Shanghai, China, my goals changed. I was like, I want to travel to this place. I learned about investing. And all of a sudden I realized that, okay, I'm going to need some kind of budgeting. I'm going to need some kind of concept of numbers at a minimum, because otherwise that 5-star hotel and that fancy restaurant, just became the way I would spend money. And it wasn't until then that I realized like, my frugalness and I don't look at frugal as a bad word. I look at it as like more of a minimalist kind of a philosophy. And I realized that only serves me so far. And I think that's what a lot of people do. The more money you make, the more money you spend, like you mentioned, Marilee. And so for me, that was like a turning point of like, actually a budget is not necessarily a terrible bad thing. It will help me be able to travel more like I want to be able to travel because I'll know how much money I have to spend on traveling. For example, I rather spend money on that nicer hotel than, getting those couple extra eating out during a regular week or whatever it may be. And so that for me was my big like aha of like, okay, yeah, there's some real benefits to knowing how much money you have and how much you want to spend and how much you want to invest and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking about that. And I think a big clue that you need a budget, and a budget doesn't have to be something that you are spending a million hours on every month, but a real clue that you need to have some sort of sit down to figure out your money is if you have consumer debt. So if you have credit card debt that you just can't seem to pay down, that is a really good clue that you will benefit from doing a plan for your monthly money.
Absolutely. So I could not agree more. That was a hard lesson for me to have to learn, but I did learn, and it ultimately made a difference. So mistake one, not having a budget. So let's move on to mistake number two, setting up your budget without really any knowledge or understanding about how much you're spending in different categories and how much you owe every month on different bills and things like that. And I will share first about this. So once I was like, okay, I have this debt. I don't like it. It doesn't feel good. I really need to like get a handle on my spending. I need to make a budget so that I can try to pay everything down. So I knew I needed a budget. I would just sit down at my computer or with a notebook, and I would write down the different categories of spending, like groceries or going out, or my bills. I had like those fixed expenses like my mortgage and things like that listed out, and then I would just make up how much money I thought I should have for each of them. Like, how about 150 on groceries? That should work. How about this much for whatever? Like, I was literally just making up numbers, and without fail, my budget was blown at the beginning of every single month. By the middle of the month, it was all goofed up because I was just making up numbers. I wasn't using any like hard facts or history of spending to like create my budget. And I think that was always a huge mistake for me.
Yeah, I agree. Like understanding and thinking about those numbers and what might hit you. Like for me last year, it was medical bills, right? I had a breast cancer scare, and there were a lot of expenses because we're here in the United States now and we have a high deductible healthcare plan. And I really had no concept of how much those bills would be. And so I was budgeting without that information. Thankfully, the American medical system lets you make payments at no interest and such. Like I get these big bills and I don't have to pay them all at once, thank God. But it wasn't until I was in that situation that I was like, oh my gosh, I need to be setting aside X amount of money in my budget every month because I might have big bills like this. And, hopefully this year I don't, but I learned from that, mistake of not having kind of that extra money. I learned that I have to budget that this year again, because even if I don't need it, I'm going to probably need it at some point in the future. So, not knowing all of that information can be really difficult, but that takes us to your point, Marilee, of like reevaluating each year as well. Like this, it's not a once and done by any means, right? Like you have to continue to grow with your budget because life circumstances change.
No, they definitely do. And before I share my mistake around this particular point, I like what you brought up about your budget serving you. And I tend to have a yearly theme for my budget. So last year it was travel. So I strategically made a hefty travel budget because that is something I wanted to do in 2023. This year it is health. So I am allowed to do those things. So I have a massage booked on Friday. I'm going to do some yoga classes, and like no guilt, but it is my theme. And spending on that theme makes you feel like amazing because you're really putting money towards what's important. And I don't mind taking it away from Uber Eats or that kind of stuff. But my budgeting fail was I spent so much time on budgeting, and I created the perfect budget for my ideal self. I looked at all the historical data of what I was spending and decided what perfect me would buy. And I could never stick with it because it didn't fit my lifestyle. I had a long commute to work, And I needed to have room for some convenience when life got real. Like when my kids got sick, that was not going to be the night that I meal prepped for the week ahead. So it's budgeting for perfect you instead of flexible real life you.
That's such a good point. And that actually is like having all the info, right? That's kind of how I titled this mistake. That is part of the information. Like, what if I have health things come up? What we need to have some conveniences built in because life does happen and life does get crazy. And, so those are all things to consider. And I agree with you about your budget being kind of I've called it something weird before, like a working document or something. Like it needs to have like flexibility. We've even sometimes changed ours. So we're kind of a traditional like spreadsheet budgeting team. We keep ours on Google Sheets. We both have it on our phone so we can look at how much we spend in different categories or whatever. But I think that we've had to review ours sometimes almost every other month. We were like, oh shoot, we forgot that we have this bill that comes up every 6 months. We didn't put that in our budget. We got to adjust. So there are just so many things I think that come up on a regular basis that people shouldn't feel like they failed because their budget didn't work for a few months. That just means, oh, I have to make some changes because I forgot to include whatever, or I didn't realize that these conveniences were going to be so important. And I loved how you talked about putting your value, like using that as a guide for your annual budget. That is so important because a budget shouldn't feel like torture. It shouldn't feel like a consequence. It should feel like a guide to kind of help you get where you want to be. And when I changed my mindset about my budget and realized that it was going to help me like feel better about money, it was going to help me get my debt paid off, it was going to, like in your instance, help you pay for travel, help you pay for those health things that you enjoy, it makes a huge difference, like our mindset. So the third mistake that kind of leads us into it is like completely unrealistic budgeting. I think that when you set up this pie in the sky budget of kind of like what you were saying, Mary Lee, like this like ideal perfect you, right? This is how much she would spend. When we set up those really unrealistic budgets, we absolutely set ourselves up for failure because nobody is going to be a perfect spender all the time. Nobody's going to never order out. Nobody's ever going to like not want to buy a new pair of shoes or whatever you like to spend, not go to a nice hotel or a nice tip. You know what I mean? Like that unrealistic budget that none of us can stick to, like how I used to say like $150 for groceries or whatever. Like I'm like, I would be eating top ramen the last week of the month if I legitimately stuck with that, right? Because you can't buy like vegetables and proteins and things. You got to think about all of that stuff. Do you guys have any examples of maybe clients that you've worked with or anyone you know that like had some really unrealistic budget expectations that kind of set them up for failure?
I'll weigh in on this. So when I do spending planning with clients, there's categories of expenses. So for most of us, we have expenses that are fixed every month. So mortgage, your rent, your utilities, they may seasonally change, but they're fairly easy to predict. And that category, it's easy for us to go through our banking or credit card history to get an idea of those expenses. Then there's the other two categories that get messier. So it's your daily life expenses, groceries, eating out, things that you buy on a monthly basis, but you have some influence over. Those can be a little trickier to determine, but they're usually not huge amounts. And then the third category is where people really run into trouble. And these are the expenses that don't happen month to month. They're the things that we tend to forget about. So if you have pets, it's their annual vaccinations and appointments. It's gifts. It is travel and healthcare, home repairs, and a lot of those we can actually reasonably expect. So it's looking at budgeting instead of looking backwards, it's starting to think ahead, like what is coming up this year for me? And I find it helpful sometimes to just get a calendar out and look, and especially if you're employed, say you have a conference to go to, or you have a family get together, like have a look at what is in your calendar, because that can give you a lot of information on what you might be able to expect for the year. Because that's the part that I find most people miss. The other thing is it is much easier to budget when your income is the same all the time. It is really difficult when your income varies. So definitely give yourself some grace. It takes longer than you think to figure out a good process and to know how to look at your numbers. It is complicated. Like our financial life is complicated. So give yourself, just feel good about what you are doing and any step that you're taking. This is not perfection. This is going to be a little bit fluid and a little bit messy at times.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. So I've kind of moved into that realm of not having, not kind of, I have moved into that realm of not having a salary that's the same 12 months a year, right? And that's a big transition. And the question is, how do I budget when some months I bring in more than others? And how do I have the cash flow to pay my bills when some months bring in more than others? For example, our investment property, ski season right now is our big season. And so the prices are higher and we bring in more income, but I can't spend all of that right now. I've got to budget that out because it will sit empty, literally 100% empty for 2 months. So 60 nights, I will be bringing in nothing from that property. And so that has been a big aha for me. And then COVID, we couldn't even rent it out. I realized my emergency savings needed to be even bigger than I had it at. I had it at 3 months because people say 3 to 6 months, I'm safe, right? But then COVID hit and I can't rent out my property anymore for 2 months. And all of a sudden I was pulling out of my emergency savings. And so there are these, I thought my budget was good until situations, right? Until I realized the condo's empty, until I realized I have to pay the mortgage. And so, like you said, Marilee, it is complex. And over time, if you're focusing on it and spending time on it and have the mindset that I can do this and it does work out, I just need to put a little bit of time and work into my strategy for budgeting. I am a Mint app person. It's going away March something very soon. And so I'm like, what am I moving to? Because I do look at it every single day. So I do have a good conceptual understanding of my numbers. So I can get through those months with no income or less income, for example. And so, just having that mindset too of I can do this and I can spend an hour a week working on money in some way. That way I'm not creating a budget that's unrealistic at times versus other times, right?
Yeah, I see that with people with variable income. You pretty much are living month to month, in the sense that it is something that you need to look at. So what you're earning this month can be used to plan ahead for the future month. And just what is so helpful is knowing your business expenses and knowing your personal expenses. So you know your baseline. And when you have a better month, you just know the ratio. This goes to tax, this goes to future slow months, and this can be fun money because we did an awesome job at renting out our condo.
Yeah.
So I have a question because I think that this lines up with unrealistic budgeting, and I bet that people have this question. So you guys can weigh in. When you make your budget, let's say you make $4,200 a month. Should you budget out for every penny of that $4,200 paycheck? Or should you budget out like the $4,000 and just use that $200 as like a cushion, knowing that some things might go up a couple bucks or down? Like, what do you guys recommend for that? Do you budget every penny that's coming in on the paycheck?
I actually really like the idea of the buffer. Because over time, as I do this for longer and longer, I'm writing down, healthcare. The water bill's bigger in the summer, watering the lawn or whatever it might be. But but there's still like unexpected stuff. Even if you're budgeting in $50 a month for car expenses, there's life happens, especially if you own a home. Home ownership is expensive. All of a sudden you need a new heater, were you budgeting for that? So I really like your idea of and I think this is kind of how I do it, is of the 4,000 is budgeted. And then you have the little bit of 200 buffer to go where it needs to go. I like that one. I weigh in on that one.
Okay.
I would say it depends. So I have some clients that I work with that like to allocate every dollar, and that works for them. I definitely tend to err on the side of being conservative. So if you're unsure about your income, you just project for a lower income. And I tend to overestimate expenses versus like trying to get to the precise number. What I do with clients is for those less predictable amounts, we actually put them in their spending plan, and so that they're strategically putting money away for those things each month. So when that house repair happens, they have money set aside, and they're not living off of that money month to month. So we put some strategy aside. And where budgeting gets tough is clients that have things like ADHD. It can be very difficult to find the time to focus and look at your money. That's where automation is really, really fabulous. So just having strategic withdrawals when you get paid to go to your other financial goals, and just knowing what number you have to work with. And I did this myself. I took a trip to Italy. I created my budget. I figured out what I could spend in a day. And we did this 3-week trip. And I think I was within $100 of my budget.
That's awesome.
That's great. I think that the overarching theme here is, remember, these mistakes are going to happen. We're all going to make budgeting mistakes, no matter who you are, no matter how much your income is, right? We're going to make these mistakes. And then just remembering them and learning from them moving forward. And then remembering that budgets are fluid. Like, we might have to change from one year to the next, 1 month to the next, one part of the year. Maybe somebody gets a different job, or you have to put your child in daycare and you hadn't planned for that at the beginning of the year. Like, there are all these little things that can come up. And I think that the big takeaway, that what I'm listening to what you guys are saying, you all have so much good advice, is to not feel defeated if your budget has a mistake, or if there's an issue and you have to change it, that's just how it is, right? We are all just going to have these mistakes, and then we have to be like, oh shoot, let me kind of revamp this and figure it out. And so I think that that's a really good action step for this week for everybody, is to just take some time and think about what your mindset is around your budget. Like, do you think of it as this like terrible, torturous thing? Or do you think of it as this like positive guide that's helping you? And then maybe if you think about it super negative, you could think about why, and maybe how you can shift that to be a little bit more positive. And think about your budget as a guide to help you, not this like restrictor, that it's really there to help you. And you will find these questions in the series download, so you can take some time to read them over, reflect. If you want to write your answers, you can do that too. So thank you so much for being with us this episode, and we look forward to chatting more common money mistakes next week.